Always start with a sketch. How many times have you heard me say that, especially when you're looking at some of my homework solutions? You're looking at some of my tips files for all the homeworks that I try to post on my Canvas site. I repeat that over and over again, and that's because I heard it so much from my own professors. And in a lot of cases, I was resistant to adopting their recommendations. But typically, they provided me with enough feedback to encourage me to adopt their recommendations. And so, what does start with a sketch mean? Well, typically, you want to somehow draw your picture, a hand-drawn sketch of your equipment, whether it's a piston and cylinder, a closed system, a rigid vessel, closed system, a turbine, open system, compressor, open system. You get the idea. And then early in the class, you drew a PV diagram, and that was almost like that was required or requested. There were no requests for that when I was a student. It was you'd better draw that PV diagram or else. Um, but now, have you noticed that we get into chapters 5 and 6, and we're drifting away a little bit from the PV diagram, and we're putting more emphasis on the TS diagram. And so I felt like, and there are some reasons for that, by the way. And so I thought I would give a short little review of depict when we start with a sketch. Not only we start with that equipment sketch, but typically we want to start with a TS diagram if we don't start with a PV diagram. But for the rest of the class, in many of your homework, quiz, and test problems, you're going to want to include a TS diagram as part of your sketch, as part of your start with a sketch discipline. And so the important part of this particular video has to do with sketching on TS diagrams, reversible and irreversible processes. So let's review quickly what's a reversible process. Well, that's one that can be reversed and leave no trace of the process on the surroundings or the system itself. Okay. What's irreversible? What would be an irreversible process? Heat transfer across a finite temperature difference, particularly as it relates to inside the open or closed system. So heat transfer that's internally irreversible. Unrestrained expansion, that always causes a process to be irreversible. Lost opportunity to do work, that would be like taking the bowling ball and dumping it off a cliff, and you could have done work by charging up a battery, but you didn't. That's lost opportunity to work. Direct conversion of work to heat, that's plugging in a space heater into the wall, the electric outlet of the wall. That's directly converting work to heat, very irreversible. Friction, mixing of two substances together, and combustion, those are all irreversible processes. And so a very important point, this seems kind of silly, but it's important for me to communicate to you on your start with a sketch discipline through the rest of the course. If you have a process that is identified as irreversible, such as let's say a turbine, a steam turbine, where a number of the turbine blades are bent or messed up somehow, well, that's going to be a measure of if turbine blades are bent, you're not going to get good performance out of those blades. It's not going to transmit the torque to the shaft that's rotating. That would be unrestrained expansion. So you're not getting the work out of the steam that you otherwise would have. That's an irreversible process. Friction, another example of irreversible process. When you're trying to depict that process on a TS diagram or a PV diagram, either way, you need to depict that irreversible process as a dashed line. That indicates to yourself and to other engineers that you can't take the area under the curve. That's critical. You can't take the area under the curve under the dashed line because it's dashed, right? It's just not allowed. Reversible processes on a TS diagram, remember our tried and true definition, it says you can visualize heat transfer Q as TDS, the area under the curve, as long as you're going across a reversible path. Okay. And so when you're sketching, when you're starting with a sketch on your TS diagram, a process path is a solid line or a smooth curve. Either of these, a lot of times I'd say straight line, and that's not a good description at all. Here's a smooth line. Straight line, of course, also is a smooth line, but these process paths can be integrated to visualize heat transfer on the TS diagram. And that's an important point to make. When you have a reversible process, you are entitled to draw that process 1 to 2 or 3 to 4 and on and on and on as smooth curves or straight smooth lines. And I'll repeat again, if you have a irreversible process, you must draw it as a dashed line. And typically we draw it as a straight dash line because we don't really know what the path is anyway. We cannot integrate it. We can't visualize the area under the curve. All right, so just to try to bring this point home, here's visualization of 2 reversible and 2 irreversible processes. What's this one? What's 1 to 2? What else would you describe process 1 to 2 to be other than reversible? Think about that. If that were a quiz question, could be. Well, process 1 to 2 is constant entropy, isn't it? All right. That's an isentropic process. It's reversible and adiabatic. Q is 0. Area under the curve from 1 to 2 is 0. Okay, 3 to 4. I've shown it as a straight, smooth line. It's reversible. Okay. What else could you say about this particular process? I could say that T is constant. So this would be a reversible isothermal process. And it's a little subtle, but we would describe this as an internally reversible process. Okay. Even if you're receiving heat from a higher temperature reservoir, that would be an external irreversibility. But as far as the process 3 to 4 is going, as far as the material inside the control surface knows, it's internally reversible. So process 3 to 4 would be described as a reversible isothermal process. That would be similar to the Carnot cycle type process, reversible isothermal. Okay, 5 to 6. Well, that would be one that was clearly called irreversible. The entropy is increasing. Okay. But there's no way to integrate that. We can't really visualize whether there's heat added or heat rejected or if it's adiabatic. We just don't know. Okay, so that's all we can say is process 5 to 6 is irreversible, and we cannot visualize the heat transfer. Positive, negative, 0. Process 7 to 8. Okay, same idea. It's irreversible. We can't tell if heat is added, rejected, or if it's insulated, adiabatic. So the reason is that it's shown as a dashed line. It's clearly some irreversible process. So all of those are bona fide ways to depict processes on the TS diagram. I really want to drive home how you depict when you start with a sketch. It's going to be very important that you understand the difference between an irreversible process and reversible processes as you go along. So we've reached the recap again. So important point, it seems silly. We didn't crunch any numbers here, but it's going to, if you can commit some of this to your memory and learning banks, that's going to help you when you start with a sketch TS diagram for an awful lot of your problems throughout the rest of this class. Smooth curve or solid line, it's an internally reversible process. A dashed line, that's an irreversible process. Not too bad. We didn't crunch any numbers. We didn't derive anything. We refreshed our memory a little bit about reversible and irreversible processes. And that's going to be so our understanding of those categories of process types, reversible and irreversible, is really going to pay off for you if you've got a good handle on that throughout the rest of this class.